She rose with the venom of a serpent's kiss and fell with the silence of a prayer drowned in blood. Her body died on the scaffold. Her soul was dismantled long before. The scent of lilacs had long faded from the corridors of power. In their place, the cold breath of death drifted like mist through the stone walls of the Tower of London. The year was 1536, and England, a kingdom simmering with religious fury and dynastic paranoia, prepared to bury not just a queen, but a myth. Anne Boleyn, once the most dazzling and polarizing figure of the Tudor court, now lay imprisoned, her once glorious body wasting beneath a silken hood, her soul rotting slowly beneath the weight of betrayal, isolation, and divine terror. Her execution would last but a moment, yet the death began days before, in flesh, in faith, and in the festering pit of the human mind. This is the final unraveling of Anne Boleyn, her torment, her decay, her erasure. There was a time, not so long before that dreadful May, when the mere brushing of Anne Boleyn's sleeve down the corridors of Whitehall would send hearts fluttering and sycophants scrambling, as if her breath alone might grant favor or ruin. But by the second day of May in the year 1536, her name no longer echoed with reverence, but festered like a carcass behind stone walls, whispered with contempt, muttered with superstitious dread, as though to speak it aloud might summon judgment from the throne or from God himself. Her arrest did not come with violence, but with a silence far more terrifying than any scream, a silence choked by the rustling of damask skirts, the creaking of polished boots on marble floors, and the sickening weight of eyes that looked and looked away, all in the same breath. They came for her in the soft light of early morning, when the mist still clung to the windows of Greenwich like fingers too afraid to knock. The king did not send a message, he sent swords. Sir William Kingston's voice, usually stiff with duty, cracked as he informed her of the charge. Adultery, he said. Incest. Treason. The words dropped like stones into the still pool of her chamber, and the ripples of horror would never stop spreading. Anne did not faint, not immediately. Instead, she stood frozen, one hand instinctively pressing against her abdomen, as though the ghost of the child she had lost weeks earlier still slumbered there, needing her protection from a world that had already devoured its mother. As she was led through the echoing halls toward the barge that would carry her to the tower, her steps were not those of a queen, but of a prisoner who knew, truly knew, that the living could die many times before the flesh ever ceased to breathe. She wore no crown, no jewels, no armor of dignity. Her hair, unpinned and matted, clung to her temples with the sweat of disbelief, and her hands trembled as if trying to shake off the reality that clung to her skin like cold oil. On the water, the ride was slow, torturously so, and the cold wind that whipped off the Thames seemed to claw through her gown, seeking to peel away any remnants of nobility. She stared at the rippling black surface, its depths as unknowable as the fate that awaited her, and in it she saw fleeting images. Her daughter Elizabeth cooing in a cradle, her crown gleaming in candlelight, and then, in a blink, her own severed head sinking below the water like a forgotten pearl. The tower loomed not as a fortress, but as a gaping maw. It welcomed her not with heralds, but with rats scuttling beneath its gates and a foul stench that rose from the moats, a perfume of sewage, mold, and ancient blood that had soaked into the stones like ink into vellum. The same tower where she had once been crowned now received her as carrion. As she was led through its archways, guards averted their eyes, not out of shame, but fear, as though her presence might bring with it divine retribution or worse, the ire of a king they no longer dared to trust. Her chamber, bare, cold, and small, reeked of mildew and the ghosts of those who had screamed there before. The mattress, stuffed with old straw, was damp, and the walls wept with condensation, forming rivulets that trickled like tears toward the floor. Each hour brought no visitors, no friends, no champions. Only the slow, deliberate clang of guards changing posts, and the whisper of robes from priests whose prayers came hesitant and hollow. Alone, stripped of all titles but one, traitor, Anne collapsed onto the bed, her frame racked with sobs that shook the very mortar around her. Her voice, once sharp as a blade in court, now rasped with salt and sorrow, pleading for God's mercy or madness to claim her before Henry did. She prayed until her lips bled, until her knees bruised upon the stone, until her mind spun like a wheel with no axle. Was this divine punishment for ambition? Was she Eve, undone by desire, or Job, tested beyond the limits of flesh? When no answer came, she pressed her palms to her ears to drown out the growing chorus in her skull. A voice like her own, but twisted, laughing, accusing, whispering that she had built her palace from bones and now lay buried beneath it. And in the darkness of her confinement, as the hours bled into days, Anne began to rot, not in flesh, not yet, but in spirit, dignity, and memory, erased not by the sword, but by the slow suffocation of abandonment. They had called her whore, witch, serpent. But what remained was simpler, a woman, cold and forgotten, waiting for her name to be chiseled from history and her neck to be offered like a prayer no one would ever answer. The tower did not kill Anne Boleyn with blade or flame. It gnawed at her mind, slow and deliberate, like rats behind wainscoting, their tiny teeth carving tunnels through soft wood and softer reason. As the days bled forward in the rotting light of early May, the air within her cell thickened with decay, not only of the flesh, which still clung to her bones with the sickly pallor of sleeplessness and starvation, but of thought, of faith, of identity. What entered those walls had been a queen. What now paced in loops across damp flagstones was a creature hollowed by betrayal and pregnant with dread. Each new accusation arrived like a nail driven into her spine. Adultery, whispered with the hiss of envy. Incest, spat with the rancid breath of liars. Witchcraft, murmured like a prayer and a curse in one. They bloomed within her like tumors, swelling with fever and shame, until she could scarcely hold herself upright. Her once graceful posture, the swan-necked elegance that had turned the king's gaze from kingdoms, deteriorated into spasms, into lurching fits, her shoulders hunched, her arms clutched around her abdomen as though her body itself sought to implode beneath the weight of unseen guilt. She began to scratch, gently at first, like one swatting away a fly. But the gestures grew frantic, her torn fingernails dragging red trails across her arms, her neck, her chest, as though some invisible thing crawled beneath her skin and she was trying to dig it out. The guards said nothing. They watched from the door as she clawed at air and shrieked at walls, their hands clutching rosaries they dared not raise. Even Kingston, who had been charged with her safekeeping, avoided her gaze, as if to meet her eyes might invite the contagion of her madness. Her hair, once the envy of every court lady, that deep, raven-black river, now hung in fetid ropes, crusted with sweat, wine, and vomit. She tugged at it in fits of weeping, tearing out clumps and whispering to them as though they were her daughter, her brother, her younger self, before ambition had metastasized into doom. Her speech fractured into endless loops, sometimes reciting lines from court masques she had once performed in, sometimes muttering childhood prayers, sometimes bursting into laughter so sudden and shrill that it curdled the marrow of those who heard it. Her voice held the music of splintering glass, and in its echoes, one could hear the crown crack. At times, she would beg for Henry VIII, not as a queen to her husband, but as a girl to a god, pleading for mercy from the same lips that once sang his praises in bed and in chapel. "He loves me still," she would whisper into the straw-stuffed mattress, her breath hot and sour with sickness. "He will come for me, won't he?" But the next moment, she'd recoil from the shadows as though they were executioners, murmuring that she heard the sword sharpening, that she felt the cold kiss of steel already pressed to her nape. She would press her head against the stone wall, listening, whispering, "Split me like an egg, just do it, do it." At night, oh those nights, the candlelight flickered like hellfire against the glistening walls, and in the dark corners of her vision, the wolves returned. They circled her bed, paws silent on the stone, eyes too human. Sometimes they bore the face of her father, leering with aristocratic indifference. Sometimes they were faceless but bled from their maws, dragging behind them broken-legged children with missing jaws. She dreamt of blood-soaked linens, of infants born without skin, of tiny skeletal hands clawing from her womb, whispering, "You are our tomb." One morning, a priest was brought to her, a frail man who recoiled the moment he stepped into the chamber, his nose wrinkling at the smell. The coppery tang of menstrual blood long unstopped, the sour rot of fevered flesh, the piss-soaked floor where Anne had lost all shame. He lifted his cross, his fingers trembling, and began a prayer. But she interrupted, lurching forward, eyes wide and unseeing, and spat wine into his cassock. "Where is your God?" she hissed. "He bled me empty and left me here to drown in the afterbirth of a dead kingdom." He fled. He did not return. And still the walls wept. Long rivulets of damp seeped from the cracks in the stone, forming shapes that she insisted were messages from Mary. Not her sister, not the Virgin, but some terrible third Mary who judged her from behind the veil. Sometimes she traced the rivulets with her tongue, claiming the moisture held confessions. Other times she whispered into the floorboards, seeking counsel from the bones beneath, begging for advice from the spirits of queens long since buried. By the end of that week, Anne Boleyn was no longer a woman imprisoned. She was a shrine of madness, a reliquary of hysteria, a bleeding altar to a faith undone. And those who passed her door, guards, servants, scribes, crossed themselves in haste. For in her moans they heard not treason but prophecy, and feared that to hear her too long was to be marked by her fall. She was still breathing, yes, but it was the breath of a cathedral burned and left hollow, of a bell that rang with no sound, of a body whose soul had already begun to rot. It began not with a shout, but with a name, George, hissed like venom between the jaws of those who once bowed low to the rising sun of the Boleyn house. George Boleyn, brother, blood, mirror, anchor, now dredged from his chambers like rotting meat from a noble feast and thrown into the same festering maw of treachery that had already begun to devour his sister from the inside out. The air itself changed when he entered the tower, thickening with a dread so visceral it clung to the throat like mildew. And all who passed through that shadowed threshold felt the quiet horror of the machinery grinding into motion, a court turning on its own bones. Anne did not know at first. They kept it from her, hoping to fracture her more cleanly by degrees. But she felt it, as if the walls themselves whispered it, as if the cold in her marrow howled his name across the night. When she finally learned, from the flickering mouth of a jailer too superstitious to lie outright, her body folded as though the very structure of her bones had been made of wax. George, her brother, her other self, accused of incest, of unnatural congress, of sin so monstrous it curdled even the blackened souls of those who authored the lie. The whispers were not just cruel, they were ritualistic, designed not only to kill, but to damn. Some said George had wept when they arrested him. Others said he laughed. A few claimed he recited scripture as he was dragged past the gates, quoting St. Peter and Satan in the same breath. Anne did not care which was true, for truth, by then, had become a luxury drowned beneath the tide of orchestrated betrayal. What mattered was that he was there, somewhere beyond the walls, perhaps in the adjacent cell, perhaps already dead. His name carved into a ledger and his soul signed over to infamy. She began to bleed again, not from the womb but from the skin. Her palms rubbed raw from pressing against the cold stone floor as she knelt, over and over, chanting prayers that grew more fevered, more fragmented, until they ceased to resemble language and became a kind of animal music. Part dirge, part invocation, part scream. Her fingers left streaks of crimson along the walls, sigils of desperation, of a woman whose reality was melting into something primordial. She called his name in the dark, sometimes gently, as though he were a child asleep in the next room, sometimes howling it as though trying to summon the dead from the belly of the tower. The tower answered, not with salvation, but with echoes. She heard him, she swore it. His voice distorted by distance, begging, cursing, moaning through cracked lips. Or was it the rats? Or the stones? Or the voice that now lived inside her, the one that repeated her own name in mockery, telling her over and over that she had brought them all to ruin with her pride, her sex, her smile. The Boleyn name, once carved into court tapestries and whispered like prophecy among the ambitious, now festered like a wound that would not scab. Even the courtiers she had lifted with her favor, men she had fed with her own hands, women she had adorned in silks, voices she had made heard, turned from her like dogs from a poisoned carcass. They came, some of them, to testify. Their eyes were rimmed with fear, their tongues heavy with betrayal. "She bewitched him," one said. "They were too close," muttered another. One spoke of catching a glance, as though incest could be seen in the twitch of an eyelash. They wept as they lied. Then they bowed. Anne's body responded not as royalty, not even as a prisoner, but as something more primal, a creature cornered, caged, decaying. She shivered violently, though the chamber was still, the fever inside her baking her blood until it felt like tar. Her fingernails broke from their beds. Her gums bled when she whispered. Her skin peeled in patches from her knuckles where she clawed at the floor, carving one word into the stone, over and over. Innocent. The word became her rosary, her mantra, her madness. The guards began to whisper of omens. One claimed to see blood bubbling from the wall, seeping from the mortar like the tower itself was weeping. Another swore that Anne's reflection in the wash basin had no eyes. A priest refused to enter her cell after midnight, claiming her prayers sounded like prophecy, or curses, and that her laughter chilled him more than the wind off the Thames. But what broke her most was the silence that followed. No verdict, no message, no mercy. Just the hollow knowing that her brother was suffering somewhere nearby, and that she had been named in the process of his ruination. George, who had once tied ribbons in her hair as a girl, who had danced with her before the court when no other dared, who had warned her, softly, always softly, that ambition breeds appetite, and appetite breeds monsters. She dreamed of him nightly now, sometimes whole, sometimes headless, sometimes ablaze, sometimes with eyes filled with mercy, sometimes with the hatred of one betrayed by blood. And always he said the same thing. "You made me your king, Anne. You crowned me in sin, and now I wear your punishment like a shroud." By the end of the fourth day, Anne no longer wept. Her eyes had dried to glass, her mouth split at the corners, her limbs moved like they belonged to someone else. She lay curled like a fetus, listening for his ghost, her spine pressed against the stone as though trying to sink inside the wall and vanish with it. The tower did not echo with the clash of swords or the roar of justice, only the soft scratching of a woman writing her innocence in blood, long after the world had stopped listening. There was a time, not so distant, yet impossibly unreachable, when Anne Boleyn had knelt before altars gilded in gold, her hands folded in prayer beneath stained glass saints, her soul still cloaked in the illusion that heaven took sides in the quarrels of queens. But now, inside the stone womb of the tower, where the light of God could not reach and the air itself seemed steeped in purgatory, faith had become something darker, not a comfort, but a cage, not a guide, but a blade turned inward. When the priest returned on the seventh night to offer her final confession, his cassock stiff with the weight of reluctance, his hand trembling as they clutched the book he no longer believed in, Anne reached for him with shaking, bloodied fingers, not to clutch, but to plead, her voice barely more than air, her mouth bubbling with sour saliva and half-choked psalms. "Absolve me," she rasped. "If I am to die, let me go clean. Let me go whole." But he flinched as her fingers touched the cuff of his robe, recoiled not as a servant of God, but as a man before an omen, his face pale with dread, his lips moving silently as though warding off some creeping contagion. And in that moment, Anne knew. She was no longer seen as a woman, nor a queen, nor even a sinner. She was a relic of blasphemy, a vessel of divine punishment, a living heresy that walked and bled and begged for mercy where none would come. The priest fled. He did not offer absolution. Left alone in her sanctified rot, Anne collapsed to the floor, her body twitching like a crucified animal, her nightdress soaked in urine and blood, her breath hitching in ragged gasps that smelled of rot and wine and old, sour meat. The walls echoed her sobs with malicious glee, returning them twisted, her voice coming back not as echo, but as mockery. She began to chant, "This is not my soul. This is not my sin." Again and again, as she traced invisible symbols into the filth on the floor, sometimes crosses, sometimes something else, her fingers leaving trails of skin where the nails had sloughed off entirely. She bit her own tongue raw to keep the demons from crawling down her throat. She stuffed straw into her ears to block the singing of the damned she heard beneath the stones. Those who brought her food did so now with gloves and averted eyes. They dropped the bowls and fled, whispering that the queen consort was possessed, or worse, that her madness was contagious, a spiritual pestilence passed not through breath, but through gaze. One guard claimed he saw a shadow behind her eyes, like a second pair of pupils watching from the back of her skull. Another swore she floated in her sleep, her body rising an inch above the straw and twitching in time with her murmured prayers. The tower became not her prison, but her monastery of torment, where God would not tread, and the devil took communion nightly in the blood she coughed onto her sheets. And still, she prayed, not for salvation, but for understanding. The night before her death was a long and wheezing creature, breathing in fits from the gaps between the stones. The wind hissed under the door like a serpent, and Anne, seated in the corner like a marionette with her strings cut, did not sleep, nor cry, nor speak. Her body had gone still, too still, as though it already understood it no longer belonged to her. Her toes had blackened at the tips from cold and infection. Her heels, raw and open, left small crimson moons upon the floor where she had shuffled in circles for days. She stared at her own hands for hours, blistered, trembling things, cracked from prayer and panic, as if they belonged to a stranger whose sins she now carried in her gut like a stone baby. Dawn did not rise that morning. It bled. Gray and metallic, it soaked the tower in a pallor that dulled all color and sharpened every shadow. When the door creaked open, she did not look up. Only when the priest, pale and sweating beneath his robes, whispered her name like an apology. Only then did she stir, lifting her face slowly, revealing a mouth swollen from biting through screams, and eyes that had cried themselves empty. He offered her final rites, but her lips barely moved. Her voice was gone, used up by days of pleading with ghosts. They dressed her in a dark gray gown, modest, unlaced at the back for ease of decapitation, and a linen coif to bind her hair. The queen had once been adorned in rubies and silk, her beauty weaponized like divine prophecy. Now she looked like a widow of herself. Her bare feet, cracked and leaking pus, stepped silently over the stones as she was led into the courtyard where executioners prayed not for strength, but for precision. The soldiers stood with eyes averted, some clutching relics, others whispering fragments of psalms, as though the very air might drink their guilt. And then there was him, the Frenchman, summoned like a butcher from a black cathedral. His blade, hidden beneath layers of cloth until the final moment, was said to gleam unnaturally, as though it thirsted. He did not speak to her. He paced, rehearsed, glanced to the sky as though awaiting divine signal. Some said he'd executed nobles before, others whispered he'd once killed a man so cleanly the corpse stood upright for a moment after. Either way, Anne saw what she needed to in his eyes. Not cruelty, not compassion, but detachment. The kind a gravedigger has for coffins. As she ascended the scaffold, the boards creaked beneath her, each step echoing like a drumbeat in some blasphemous liturgy. The crowd below, lords, ladies, servants, strangers, watched with the mute fascination of those who hunger to witness a myth bleed. A few wept, fewer still prayed. Most waited. Her final speech, once practiced with the polish of a courtier, emerged in fragments, her words shaking like leaves in a storm. "Good Christian people," she began, then faltered, her tongue thick with dryness, her gaze darting like a hunted deer's. I die the king's faithful wife." The lie stuck in her throat like a shard of bone. I forgive him. I pray God will forgive us all." Forgiveness. That final, savage ritual. She knelt. The hem of her gown stirred in the breeze, lifting like a veil before a bride, and the morning air turned suddenly sharp, filled with the scent of damp wood, burning tallow, and blood yet to spill. The straw beneath her knees was soaked from the rain of the night before, but to Anne it felt warm, as though the earth itself anticipated her offering. She began to pray, not to God, but to herself, to the part of her still untouched by rot, to the little girl she had once been, dancing in fields of Kent, long before crowns and beds and betrayals. And then, a hand reached silently from behind. The executioner called for his sword. He did not tell her when. She had requested that. She did not want to know the moment. So he whispered in French to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." And in that moment, Anne turned her head ever so slightly, as if startled by the sound, as if searching for her savior or for the end. And in that breath between knowing and not knowing, he struck. The blade split the air like a scream unloosed from steel, and when it met her neck, it sang a soundless song of liberation and ruin. Her head fell forward onto the straw, the mouth still slightly open, as if mid-word. Some said her eyes blinked twice, not from reflex, but in desperate search of her own story, now severed and spiraling into legend. Her body swayed, upright, for the briefest instant, like a marionette whose strings hadn't yet realized they were cut. The blood, dark, arterial, hot, sprayed across the scaffold, soaking the straw, speckling the priest's robe, and pooling at the edge of the wooden boards like wine spilled from an overturned goblet. And then, silence. Not peace. Silence. Like the pause between verses in a dirge, like the breath held before the storm returns. She was gone, but her absence would stain England longer than her life ever could. They buried what was left of her, the blood-washed husk, the severed grace, not with honor, but with haste, slipping her remains beneath the cold stone floor of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, like one might sweep ashes beneath a throne. No monument marked her grave. No mourning bell tolled. The woman who had once seduced a kingdom into war and a king into heresy was entombed without epitaph, her name sealed behind centuries of silence and sanctioned forgetting, as though the mere memory of her breath could still infect the lineage she once sought to shape. Anne had rewritten scripture with her body, reshaped destiny with her womb, and for that, they deemed her monstrous. They burned her name in sermons, muttered it in childbirth, taught daughters to fear it and sons to forget it. But history, like the tower's stones, remembers in whispers and weeps in silence. And so Anne became not a woman, but a shadow, long, spindled, and impossible to outrun. In death, she bloomed, a myth wrapped in martyrdom, a siren draped in scandal, a queen unmoored from the flesh and weaponized by every generation that followed, whether to vilify, vindicate, or resurrect. She is the ghost in the corridor, the breath behind the curtain, the cold that clings to the altar steps when no one else is near. She is the echo in every crown worn by a daughter of England, the price beneath the prayer of every consort who followed her to that same chapel, that same fate. She is the mother who lost her child, and the child who rose to rule an empire. She is prophecy and punishment, hunger and fire, and she is still watching. Beneath the pomp of Tudor splendor, beneath the gold and heraldry, beneath the perfumed tombs of those who once judged her, her bones remain, brittle, nameless, and humming with the fury of a story violently severed yet never fully silenced. Her execution ended in seconds, but her erasure took centuries, and still it is not complete. Because when the wind scrapes the tower walls just right, and the chapel darkens before the hour, some swear they hear a woman weeping beneath the stone, not for herself, but for a kingdom that mistook blood for justice and silence for peace.